Let's transition to Chris Fisher. Chris, would you unmute and join us?
Yeah,
Chris is
absolutely. Can you hear me?
excellent. Yeah, yeah, here you're great. Chris's book is actually part of a series that I want him to talk about, but it's titled, well, the title of the book is God is Open, but that's also the title of some of the other books in the series. What you need to know is the subtitle. The subtitle is The Hellenization of Christianity. Chris, tell us about the impetus for this book and what it's about.
So it's interesting. We just had Schmidt on the line. I got his book here, God in Motion. And
Yeah.
in his book, he criticizes the idea that Christianity was Hellenized. And so he unfortunately he left us, but it's interesting. This is directly what my book is challenging. And so I got a 5 minute intro that I would like to
Good.
present
Go
to you
for it.
guys, kind
Excellent.
of kind of prime you.
Good.
So the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. This is the Bible describing God. Compare to this second or third century text. He who is ineffable, for he is immortal and eternal, having no birth, for everyone who has birth will perish. He has no name, for whatever has a name is a creation of another. He is unnameable. He is infinite. He is incomprehensible. He is imperishable. He has no likeness to anything. He is unchanging good. He is faultless. He is everlasting. He is blessed. He is unknowable, while nonetheless knows himself. He is immeasurable. He is untraceable. He is perfect, having no defect. He is imperishably blessed. He is called Father of the universe. So, how did Judeo Christian religion move from the first quote to the second? That's the story of my book, The Hellenization of Christianity, the Pre Christian Era. Well, first, let me say that I did not enjoy writing this book. My apologies to everyone who read it. This is a book that it just needed to exist, and if no one else is going to write it, it just had to be me. This is a story that demands to be told. So I spent my life studying these texts and piecing together evidence. This book represents the first part of a two-stage journey from Israelite religion to what Nietzsche deemed Platonism for the people, which is Christianity. Christianity is Platonism for the people. So we are far removed from the ancient world. It dwells in mists and shadows. We do not have shared experience with pre-industrial agrarian societies. Just try talking to your children. Grab one of your children and tell them what life was like before the internet. They're just not going to understand. That's only 30 years ago. What about 2,000 years ago? So I grew up reading the Bible. I'd been exposed to many modern ideas about God and religion. We have a tendency just to read these ideas into the text that we're presented. Surely the people before us are just handing down unadulterated wisdom to us. Surely they know more about the material than us, and they're just relating their findings. But I was young, I was naive. I remember when I was in fifth or sixth grade, I asked my dad what kind of evidence existed that the Bible supports God's omnipresence. To his credit, he walked me into his library of books, pulled out a systematic theology text, and turned to a reference. I was shocked. There wasn't anything substantive. The author waxed poetically about being calmed by a song describing God's omnipresence. I resolved this was the best the systematic could do. It's just there's no biblical support. Objectively, the ancient Israelites did not conceive of God in terms that modern theologians love using. Their conception of God was more primitive, we're using quotes there. Religion existed in cult, in family, in ritual, and duty. There's no biblical treatise on the ineffability of God or the impeccability of Jesus. There's not room in their mental models to fit such concepts. Their religion was wholly practical. What do we need to do here and now to live better here and now? Even thoughts of afterlife were remote. We tend to be more objective when evaluating other religions. Marduk overthrew the supreme god and took control of the pantheon. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. That sounds like ancient religion. But when it comes to the Bible, we employ mitigation techniques, or as Weiss terms it, containment strategies. We anthropomorphize or otherwise dismiss what an ancient farmer would take at face value. We treat the Bible differently than other texts. Well, this book deals with those extra biblical texts. This is a widely untapped data source. How did the writers in the same time frame conceptualize God? How did pagans see Hebraic religion? The pagans, widely hostile, sometimes friendly to the Jews, seem to be completely unfamiliar with Jewish religion. The Jewish documentation itself vast shows scattered notions of deity. Interestingly enough, when the data is laid bare, patterns emerge. We see the slow roll of Platonism into the Bible, slightly in the pre-biblical text and the floodgates in post-biblical text. We see authors such as Philo of Alexandria being equated to Plato himself. we see Augustine saying the Bible is absurd unless he reads it in the light of Platonism. We see, and I show in my work, the Hellenization of Christianity.
Mm, well done. I like that. I've been thinking about you and your book this last week because I've been rereading Augustine's Confessions. And
Chapter 11 is interesting.
yes, that's what I've been focusing on because I'm writing a chapter on God and time, and that's where he talks the most about time. But just over and over, to him, it's just intuitively true that God is immutable, unchangeable, and timeless eternity. And what you show in this book is that that way of thinking about God has much more grounding in Hellenization, Hellenistic philosophies, than it does in the
Yeah.
Hebrew scriptures.
So Augustine is upfront about it. He lays all his cards on the table. He said, "Hey, I read the Bible. It's absurd. I talked to Simplicanus. I talked to Ambrose. They told me to read the Bible spiritually, and then I finally understood the Platonists were right about their perceptions of God's infiniteness, right? In incorporeality." All these Platonistic concepts. He says, then I was finally able to accept the Bible. So in chapter 11, it's interesting. He says, God cannot say, this is my beloved son, because those are words uttered in time, in sequence. God has to be eternally predestining some creature to make those noises, or else that creates within Godhead change, parts, degradation. And in the Platonist metaphysics, these things were not allowed. These things had to be mitigated. So, what was Jesus to Augustine? If you read Confessions, the Platonistic metaphysics was one in which you escape the material world to ascend to a higher level of existence, to a non-physical plane. And so there wasn't a very good way for Platonism to give some sort of mechanism. They have like a spiritual enlightening that someone could go through, introspective meditative trances. To Augustine, when he converted to Christianity, Jesus was that spark of the divine that allows people to transcend those different planes of existence. And so he took Christian concepts and merged them into Platonist metaphysics and came up with this new Platonist Christianity. That's why Nietzsche is so correct when he says Christianity is Platonism for the people, because Augustine's work became mainstream. He became one of the most influential people, the person who said that the Bible was absurd until he read it in light of Platonism. His words.
Yeah. And Nietzsche's not the only one to make that claim, but that I like that you bring him in there. I was noticing, so again, I just read the Confessions. I found myself in the margins making a check mark every time Augustine, who is writing this book as a prayer, every time he asks God to help him with something, which is an assumption that God can respond, and yet the God he believes in can't respond. So, like, there's this internal contradiction in the confessions themselves of him praying a prayer to a God, thinking, asking for things, and yet him not believing God has that capacity.
So what you also need to do is when you're reading Confessions, every time he says something, I saw this in my mind's eye or something like that, that's him getting truth through meditative introspection. The Platonist way of reaching the divine is they'd sit in these trances and then try to ascend mentally. Plotinus writes about this several times. But the first part of my book, sadly enough, cuts off right after Jesus. It goes to Philo of Alexandria, and we don't cover the post-Christian authors. So my book focuses mainly the Hellenization of Christianity, part one, on the pre-Christian Platonization that was already happening in the church. You see concepts of God slowly, gradually move towards these Platonistic ideals, ideas such as omniscience of all future events. So you see indications, perhaps in early texts, maybe of God gaining some sort of omniscience of future events that are not apparent in previous texts, but God is still a person. God still sits on a throne in heaven. And then you start after the first century, see God's corporeality, his body disappearing and replaced with abstract metaphysics in time after that. And so you see these attributes come on little by little, and you could plot these and you could understand the slow roll. Alexander the Great, he conquers Israel, and he takes on a campaign of Hellenization of the known world. And who was his teacher? Aristotle, the direct disciple of Plato. Now, Aristotle and Plato had their differences, but the Neoplatonists and the Platonists read Aristotle to understand Plato's secret teachings. Because guess what? Aristotle had direct access to Plato and a lot of things that Plato's saying. So when Aristotle is arguing against Plato, Platonists will read that and say, oh, okay, so here's what Plato believed about such and such topic. It's really interesting. And so you got a direct line from Plato to the Hellenization of all of history, basically. And you have distinct data points where you can map this out and see that pattern.
Interesting. All right. Another thing that made me think as I was reading your book, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. Um, I once did a word study of the words agape and philia in the New Testament. And in the Gospels, I think 3 out of 4 times, I can't remember the percentage, but a high number of times, agape and philia are verbs that people do. But in Paul's writings, it's switched around. Agape becomes a noun. Uh, and I've often wondered, does this reflect the Hellenization of Paul? And so my question is, do you think the biblical writers themselves were affected by Hellenization? And, um, is that a bad thing?
Okay, so whether something is a bad thing or not, it's probably outside the scope of it's a historical study. But
Sure.
Paul definitely had interaction with these different cults and ideas. We have
Yes.
direct allusions in there's a whole chapter on Paul within the book, and I talk about his interactions with philosophy. He uses the word philosophy one time, and it's in Colossians 2. And in Colossians 2, what's he talking about? Vain philosophy. What does this vain philosophy do? It minimalizes the material world. It says that the divine cannot be material. He says the fullness of God dwells bodily. And in Platonism, the material cannot be divine because there's a separation of hypostasises. He talks about shadow imagery, directly alluding to Plato. He knew who he's dealing with. He's dealing with proto-Gnostics, Gnostics like the Valentinians, who said that Jesus couldn't have normal body functions because that would degrade him, and he ate and drank divinity. They're trying to remove him from all change and all the scum and the dirt of normal life. This is who he's interacting with. These people who want to separate the divine from the physical. This is the push of Platonism. But
Yeah.
within Hellenistic or not Hellenistic religion, but Semitic religion, especially Israel and the Bible and even Paul, what we're looking forward to are spiritual bodies inhabiting a restored earth. It's very much physical, the renewed earth that we inhabit with spiritual bodies. Paul writes about this in Corinthians. And so it's not this Platonistic escape from the world that a lot of moderns kind of think that, oh, we die and go to heaven and we just populate heaven. No, the Bible wants a restored earth. It's focused on the physical. It's focused on, Jesus talks about having banquets in the kingdom of God on earth. And you could probably try to dismiss them as metaphor or as some sort of idiom, but it doesn't look like that's what's happening in these sayings. And so
Mhm.
Paul grew up next to a Greek city. He interacted with Greeks, and there's a very particular instance in Acts when he argues. Most of the time, he's arguing with the Jews. He's saying, "Hey, you guys are Jews," so that they share a lot of presuppositions. But when he starts arguing with Greeks, we see that on Mars Hill, Acts 15. And so I cover this all in the book. What's his arguments? His arguments is not Platonism is true. He tries to draw them to a God who is here and now, ready to accept them, can be experienced, and then he draws them eventually to the resurrection of the flesh. And that's when they scoff at him, because to them, resurrection of the flesh was nonsense. That's glorifying physical bodies again. This is not their worldview. So watch how he interacts with the Jews, and then watch how he interacts with the pagans. It's in different ways, trying to prove different things. And when he interacts with the Greek pagans, he's trying to convince them of the true God, Yahweh, rather than Jews who share those assumptions.
I've been reading a couple of contemporary New Testament scholars. One guy at Princeton, his name is escaping me, but they're making the claim that Paul is strongly influenced by Stoicism, and that's a good thing. And one of the reasons they think it's a good thing is that the Stoics believe that spirit wasn't entirely mental, non-physical, but had a physical dimension to it. And so I'm playing around with that some myself. Have you
Yeah,
run across that
yeah.
notion? Yeah.
There's I got so many books that talk about things like this. I've read it before. I can't point you to the sources. My study specifically focuses on the conception of God within the tradition. And so he might have had Stoic influences, and good or bad thing, it's historical if it did happen. Whether or not it's a good or bad thing, I'm not making value judgments.
Yeah.
Um, but his conception of God is more in line with Old Testament writers than it was with the Gnostics, with
Sure.
people, the church fathers, such as Origen of Alexandria, who is Alexandrian. And every time you hear the word Alexandrian, think Platonism. You had Astrolabus was the person who first he was the innovator of this way to dismiss features of the Bible, anthropomorphize texts in order to not take them on a straight value way. And so in his traditions, Philo of Alexandria, which Origen's under, which Augustine's under, and then who am I missing? Oh man, I just sometimes.
That's
But
all right.
all the Gnostics are coming from Alexandria too. You got the Basilides, you got the Valentinians. They're all coming from Alexandria. They're all Hellenized. They're all Platonists, and they're all arguing this metaphysics that is eventually adopted into our systematic theology text. So you go pull up a systematic theology. What does it start with? It talks about knowledge of God, then starts talking about God's incommunicable attributes. Often you'll see things like ineffability, simplicity, pure actuality. Who's talking about simplicity in the Bible? That God cannot change because change causes degradation. That's coming straight from Plato's Republic, and that's coming straight through Plotinus, a Neoplatonist philosopher. It's that those concepts, they're not part of Hebrew metaphysics. They're not change being bad, material being bad. That's not part of the Jewish worldview. These are things that are incorporated into the Christian church.
Preach it, brother. Preach. All right, we got a couple of comments. One, they're kind of outside the realm of your book, but maybe you have some thoughts. Adolf Harnack in the contemporary era is the person a lot of folks point to as sort of really raising this issue of the Hellenization of Christianity. You don't engage in Harnack here because you're doing primary source stuff, but any thoughts on Harnack's claims and whether or not Josh says he has a friend who thinks that Harnack's thesis has been proven false, which I strongly disagree. But any thoughts on Harnack?
He says a harness the Christianity was held. Well, no, I lay out the sources. I go through the primary sources. And so the purpose of my book is to be academic in that you could look at my evidence and look at my claims, and then you could decide for yourself whether or not my claims are reasonable. And so I'm not quoting like sometimes I quote third parties, but I'm quoting the primary texts. And so you can lay out the evidence and judge for yourself.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like about your book. It's a pretty fat little book because you have so many direct primary sources that you're quoting. It kind of actually reminded me a little bit of a book from Charles Hartshorne, in which he goes back and quotes people, in lengthy passages and then makes comments on it. It's very valuable.
Yeah, so there's some comments in the side about, yeah, Paul is a Hellenized Jew. Yeah, that's what my book's about, the Hellenization of Christianity. And so all these Jewish sources that you see, Enoch is one such example. You see, even within Enoch, there's portions of Enoch that were written post-Christ, and there's portions of Enoch written pre-Christ. And the concept of omniscience, when someone says, hey, the Jews conceptualize God as omniscient of all past, present, and future events, they'll point to a verse in Enoch. It turns out those are not sections that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are not attested in the earliest copies of Enoch. Those are post-Jesus additions to the book of Enoch. And you could see even within this one book how this theology changed over time. Because you just read through Enoch and look at their perception of God, who God is, what he does, what he acts like, what his character is, what his properties are, what's happening. So many times people are looking at a single aspect. But what is Platonism? Platonism is the idea that God is simple, immutable, ineffable, eternal. He's outside space. So he's an abstract entity. And so you read Enoch, he's not an abstract entity. If you read the Apocrypha, he's not an abstract entity. He's a fully personal God. That's what Semitic religion talked about. It was all about here and now, a holy, personal, and relational God. And it's turned into this abstract being that one of the attributes are impassibility. People cannot affect God. In modern systematic theologies, people cannot affect God. And so, yeah, uh, if you incorporate an impassibility into the Christian religion, that is Hellenization. That's not original to the Semitic concept of God.
All right. I think you've got lots of folks in this conference who are totally on board with your primary point. I know I am. However, and Michael Newhart, it's got, I think, making some comments in the questions here that I'm going to shape his comments in this way. Um, Chris, do you worry that maybe in your analysis of this, that maybe too you're separating Hellenism and Judaism too neatly? Maybe there's a little more overlap, or maybe some, and Paul's a good example because you've already mentioned
Yeah,
he's been influenced by Hellenism, but
they all
is
were.
there more overlap? Yeah, okay.
Okay, so the thing is that they're hearing what I'm saying and they're not listening to what I'm saying. My book is about the Hellenization of Christianity pre-Christ. My first part of my book is all about the slow movement from or the original Semitic idea of God into this Platonistic idea. And so we cover, he says, how do you respond to Martin Hegel's classic work? And I quote Martin Hegel all the time. He says Judaism was Hellenized 350 years before Jesus. Yeah, when Alexander the Great invaded and started a process of Hellenization. That's when these movements started to be incorporated. And so it wasn't fully incorporated until post Jesus, though. You don't get these ideas of ineffability and God being abstract without parts and pure actuality. Those are post Christ additions, but you do see the slow roll. And so that's what this book shows. And so one thing that I do in my book is I take God statements. How does the Bible talk about God when it gives it like an elevator speech of who God is? And then I try to find these God statements within these various texts. And then you could put them side by side and see how they change based on context or time frame. And there is the slow roll. Yes, that's
You even get
Christianity.
some of it. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh
Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Christianity began to be Hellenized after Alexander the Great. That is the thesis. But prior to that, I talk about historical Semitic religion. I talk about historical Platonism and Platonistic developments and Plato's idea of God. And these are things happening before 350, before Alexander the Great. And then there's this collision of worldviews. That's one of my chapters, is the collision of worldviews, when these different ideas start interacting. So it is a slow roll. There's a gradual process. It's not all at once. It's a slow implementation. But some places more than others, like Alexandria.
Yeah, awesome. All right, we're about out of time. So to conclude, this seems to me to be a book in a series. You got something else coming out next?
Yeah, I so the link that was pushed on the side was to my first book, which was examining the open theism of the biblical authors, in which I show there's pretty good overlap about what the biblical authors thought and conceptualized about God. That's also an academic study without a value judgment. My next book is going to be about basic open theism. Then I want to do one where I respond to the critics, such as Manuel Schmidt, and then I'll probably do
All
part two
right,
to
man.
this,
Oh,
where
he's
we
not with
do,
us.
yeah, we'll probably do part two, where it's the post-Christian era, talking about all the Gnostics and all the church fathers and all that, and the early Jews, things like that. And so the Hellenization of Christianity is the book in the series, and I'll have to go grab the link so that everyone gets the correct link to that. But I lay out the argument, I give the evidence, you're able to evaluate the evidence for yourself and make your own decisions. That's my purpose. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. I'm trying to lay out systematically evidence for my conclusions so that you could come to the same conclusions as I.
Really important stuff, Chris. I really like what you're doing. Thanks so much for being a part of Ortline this year, and talking to us about this new work.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, we are now going to transition. At the top of the hour, we're coming back to talk about John Paul Sidner's book, The Great Open Dance, Progressive Christian Theology. As I've mentioned before, all of this is going to be available as audio recordings after the event. And so I'll be sending around an email once those are ready. But thanks a lot for being a part of this discussion and the whole conference in general. See you again at the top of the hour. Consider this your invitation to OrtCon 25, Open and Relational Theology Conference in the summer of 2025. This annual week-long event will be June 30th through July 4th at the Grand Targhee Resort outside Jackson, Wyoming. Come early or stay a little longer to enjoy Yellowstone or Teton National Parks, which are both located nearby. Our lineup of speakers for OrtCon 25 is still in construction, but Brian McLaren and Anna Case Winters have already committed to speak. Joining them will be other experts in open and relational thinking. So come to learn about open and relational thought and to make friends in this vibrant community. Share your own ideas or projects and bounce your thinking off good-hearted people with sharp and creative minds. OrtCon is a family-friendly event, which means we leave plenty of time each day for hiking or reading, biking, lounging, swimming, or meditating on the mountaintop. And the weather always seems to be perfect. So plan now to join me, Brian McLaren, Anna Case Winters, and many, many more this June 30th through July 4th for OrtCon 25.